fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 4, Trash Cow.
Chet do this, Chet do that. But do they ever ask what Chet want do? No.
Chet the imp, short and covered in red fur, shook his head slowly, grumbling as he kicked open the back door of Grisbang's Grub Hub and hauled out a bag of garbage 3 times his own size. A cat yowled, and a light flickered overhead. Nobody ever asked him what was on his mind or how he was doing. Swinging the bag of trash down the back steps, he wrinkled the nostrils of his long nose as a waft of rancid mystery meat hit him hard.
One day, Chet be boss.
But for now, he had to drag the trash down to the corner before the Agdillo arrived to collect it. He loved Agdillos, the way their multitude of legs propelled them along, sanitizing the sidewalks of filth. Their massive furry bodies came in many different colors. His favorites were the red ones, like him. And they always had varying sizes of grabbers. The horns at the ends of their faces they used to pluck up the bins and tip the garbage into their wide mouths full of flat teeth. He liked to imagine Grisbang falling into that mouth. The end of the alley opened up into a wide, bustling city street with a park on the far side. Other imps, the wish collectors, had gathered around the fountain, drinking in its sparkling waters as they waited for coins to magically appear. Each time one did, a scuffle would break out to see who could reach it first and get the contract it held. Chet wished he could lay by the fountain instead of hauling trash. The ground gave a bit of a rumble, and he looked down the street. The Agdillo was a block away, gobbling down a fully loaded bin. It was a gray one, the most boring color, same color as Grisbang. He sighed and hefted his bag of rubbish into one of the dozens of dumpsters that lined the street. Still, maybe he could wait and watch it go by. He frowned as the rumbling had intensified, much more than could be caused by the beast. His large ears flapped at the sensation, and Chet attempted to book it to the alley when the asphalt in front of him split open. Wish imps cried out, massive fissures ripping the fountain apart as the ground bucked. A deafening roar and a blast of green exploded from beneath the water, launching a carefully carved statue of Imperial Overlord Kizog into the air, along with several people-sized shapes. One of them, a very shiny person, was thrown further and smashed into Chet's dumpster, causing an explosion of garbage. The little imp let out a shriek as he was peppered with rotten food and ran, wailing that the end of the world was nigh. Twisting through the air, Lucas screamed, and screamed, and screamed, until the moment he felt the ground slam into his back and the air rushed from his lungs. His eyes widened as he struggled to pull in a breath, willing his body to listen to him. It took some convincing, but he finally managed to inhale a wet gulp of air, and his mind cleared, only to focus on his inability to lift his left arm to block the spray of water. He sat bolt upright, fast enough that his head swam. Okay, so he wasn't paralyzed, but he might drown by the amount of fountain water he was being sprayed with. Lucas returned his attention to his left arm, only to see a pair of white knuckles gripping his biceps so tight his fingertips had gone numb. He looked over into that pale face and sighed. Oi, I'm gonna need that back. He shook his arm several times, attempting to stir the Arcanist from his panicked state. Atlas, still trying to sort through what had just happened, pried his fingers back and relinquished his grip on the Dryad. They had been in the portal when something had gone wrong. Blue lightning had ripped it apart, destabilizing it. He remembered twisting through the nothing, shouting, "Lucas, the robot," and a shiny metal coin smacked him on the end of his nose, and he shot back to the moment. He looked around at the destroyed fountain. "How are we alive?" If the Dryad answered him, Atlas couldn't hear the response over the shouting and screaming coming from the horde of tiny imps scurrying across the manicured grass of a city park. Before he could even reach up to his head to scratch at his cowlick, harsh whistles shrieked out over the chaos. The shrill sounds resonated through his ears, screaming at them from all directions. When no less than 18 imp-sized police officers materialized, falling out of sparkling puffs of smoke, Atlas grabbed the Dryad and began pulling him further back into the fountain. "We need to hide." The gaggle of imps shouted at the gathering crowd of citizens, some pushing them away from the scene of the crime, while others surrounded the metal man, screeching up at him in infernal. It made his skin crawl. He hated that language. It was snake-like, sinister, and deceiving by nature. Between the spray of water, Lucas watched in amazement at the speed and coordination of this impish police force. They had already clamped tiny handcuffs around the robot's thumbs. His wrists were far too large. But a joke about how easily they could be broken never fell from his mouth. 4 stone walls erupted out of the ground, instantly surrounding the robot in a small cage of concrete, before a massive 5th slab, which appeared out of nowhere, mind you, crashed down on top. After half a breath, the entire box slammed back into the ground, disappearing and taking their robot with it. The imps had waved down a different massive beast to clean up the garbage when Lucas finally shook his friend's shoulder.
What just happened to our robot? And what the hell is that thing?"
"Shush!"
Atlas hissed.
"We haven't been noticed yet."
Indeed, the imps were now split between keeping the crowd at bay and investigating another crater at the edge of the park. Lucas frowned.
"Wait, if we broke the fountain and the robot smashed into the dumpster,"
he lifted a hand,
"what caused that?"
The Dryad's words were distant against Atlas's ears. He could only comprehend the slamming of his own heart against his ribs as he remembered what else he had seen when the portal collapsed. Helpless to do anything, he watched as an armored fist latched onto the edge of the second crater. Then, a head covered in wet, blonde curls popped into view, and his suspicions were confirmed. Ruby's green eyes scanned over the throngs of tiny, hairy creatures as they scuttled about, attempting to restore order to the chaos. They were screeching at her, but she couldn't understand them over the intense pain in her head and the high-pitched tone in her ears. She spat out a glob of blood, and her gaze quickly landed on the object of her desires, the Arcanist. Her lips pulled into a dark smile as she climbed the remainder of the crater to stand on her own 2 feet.
"I think—"
Atlas paused, scrabbling to his feet. The water and slippery tiles of the fountain made all the more treacherous by the massive cast around his leg. He gripped the Dryad's bag and hauled him up.
"It's best we get moving. Now."
Ruby took 2 unsteady stomps forward and was immediately assaulted by a gaggle of tiny imps in adorable little uniforms, each one wielding a miniature weapon. She let out a pained, broken scream as she shoved the end of her boot into the stomach of the nearest one, punting it all the way to the other side of the fountain, and grabbed the overlarge ears of another, hurling it behind her. She locked eyes again with the Arcanist. She wanted so desperately to wrap her fingers around that man's neck and squeeze the life and light out of him. But the scholar would not like that. Still, there were other ways to torture a man without killing him. Lucas spat out a mouthful of fountain water and did the only thing he could think of. Let someone else decide.
What's the plan?
Scanning around at the immediate area, Atlas strained to come up with something. He couldn't outrun the battle doll on his gimp leg. Coppers were still swarming the place, and the buildings, sized only for imps, would never work as a hiding spot. He rubbed at his mouth. He needed more options.
We're running short on time here, mate.
Lucas gripped the man a little tighter, urging him to think of something.
Maybe just apologize and ask her out on a date?
Never!
Atlas roared as he ducked to avoid a furry police officer that flew past him. He glanced back to see the jewel was once again stalking towards them, leaving a pile of unconscious imps at her feet. Without thinking, he scrawled something in the air. A spell he had used so often before, he felt as if he almost didn't need the sigil to cast it.
Fireball!
Ruby would have laughed if she could, but what came out was a broken hacking sound. The rune erupted with sparks before it fizzled out of sight, replaced by a roaring ball of flame. An old dog with the same lazy tricks. She lifted her arm, ready to cancel out the spell, when it exploded several feet in front of her into a whirlwind of feathers and birds. Many, many human-sized pink birds. Giant flamingos swarmed her, squawking and shrieking, clambering over each other and her in their shock at being suddenly birthed into existence. She screamed her broken, horrid scream as she shielded her face from their flapping feathers and scraping talons. Caught in the center of the feathery tornado, Ruby began to wade through the birds, swatting and kicking, her eyes locked onto the Arcanist. But the shrill cries of imps and birds pulled her attention to see a massive, smelly beast, spooked by the flamingos, was charging straight for her, its tusks set to gore her. She fell back, landing hard on the wet stones as the creature bulldozed its way through what remained of the fountain. A spray of water and feathers clouded her vision like a vibrant snowstorm. The birds had all fled, flapping in several different directions, and the swirling chaos abated. She spat out a feather and returned her eyes to the water fountain. There was nothing left of it save for the sad gurgle of water spewing up from the broken pipe. And worse, no sign of the Arcanist. One lingering flamingo flapped past her, and her hand snapped out, wrapping her armored fingers around its slim neck. She squeezed and squeezed, a low growl rumbling from her belly, until the bird popped. It exploded into a puff of magic dust, feathers, and sparkles, leaving Ruby alone with her anger. 15 minutes. That's how long the ride from the docks to the clinic took by vehicle. But for some reason, listening to Eric drone on and on with tedious questions about something called lithium and cobalt made Indigo wish he was back in the waters with that shark. It wasn't until they had been shown to an empty, scrubbed medical room plastered with anatomical posters that Indigo finally found a moment of relative peace and quiet. He slid off the back of Duck into one of the empty waiting chairs and watched as his new elf companion paced the room, prattling off something to himself about manufacturing and chemistry.
Back on Ebra, it took me months to find the necessary components to cobble together a barely working computer.
Eric scratched at that spot behind his ear as he paced, talking mostly to himself. It had taken a king's ransom and army in order to liberate those things from the Brotherhood, but this place had so much integrated into their daily lives. They had stoplights and electric motor vehicles, Even radio communication was available. And who knew what else? After years in a pre-industrial civilization, this tiny village had his mind spinning with questions and possibilities. He paused his pacing, the smell of stringent disinfectant permeating his senses at last. Eric looked up, squinting around the room he had been ushered into, realizing for the first time they were no longer in the truck.
Wait, when did we...
He frowned a little when he saw the dog hop up onto a raised cot. Chuckling, Indiga shook his head and swung his hand out in a lazy gesture. We're at the clinic, where the best healer in all the lands will be tending to that frostbite of yours. He had been so focused, grilling the driver of the vehicle for information on the kind of range his truck batteries had in chilly northern weather, that Eric had missed the entire ride through town. But before he could cobble together any more questions about where they were and who this healer was, a bell above the door jingled pleasantly. He turned to face the doctor, ready to greet them with his patented nervous chuckle. But instead, Eric nearly missed the absolutely minute woman who had stepped inside. She was so ancient. He was certain this Selkie had bore witness to the birth of the universe. The things he could ask her.
Indiga?
She shouted at an unreasonable volume as she teetered around the room. She squinted with barely open eyes and turned to see the object of her worries.
Oh, there you are, dear.
She held out her arms for a hug. With the amount of layers she was wearing beneath that heavy parka, Eric wasn't certain this woman could put her arms back down, but was surprised when she managed to grasp the young Selkie boy in a tight hug. Laughing, Indiga leaned over to embrace the tiny woman. Grammy! Thank you for coming. He looked up to the other man with a wide smile on his face. You'll have to forgive her shouting. She's mostly deaf now.
What's that? You hit a cow?
Grammy pulled away to look her grandson over, lifting his arms above her head
and then inspecting his limp legs.
Your mother said it was frostbite. Whose cow did you run into? I told you those cars are dangerous.
His concern growing, Eric could only press his fingers against his ears to muffle the old woman's shouting. For someone so small, she certainly had a voice box on her. But, having witnessed the dawn of human innovation, maybe this ancient Selkie could answer some of his questions.
Excuse me, could I ask you a few...
Indiga held up a finger as he returned his attention to his grandmother. He reached down, pulling the hood of the fur-lined parka off over her head to help with her limited hearing. No one hit a cow, Grammy. My new friend here is the one with the frostbite. He spun her around and gestured to the elf. Eric faltered and clumsily waved at the tiny woman.
Hi. Can you tell me how long you've had access to electricity here?
But the old woman paid him no mind, or at the very least, she didn't hear him. She pulled out a tool from beneath her many shawls and began poking and prodding at every surface she could reach of him, including whacking him painfully on his left kneecap. He retreated beneath the assault, stumbled, and collapsed back onto the cot right on top of the dog. Duck let out a howl and several whines before he scrabbled out from beneath the elf and moved to the empty seat beside his master, trying his best to fit his massive bulk into the tiny waiting chair.
You're an odd-looking cow.
Grammy leaned over, squinting her tiny eyes even further at the creature that just landed on the cot before her. She shoved up the pants that covered the man's legs and tugged at several long hairs she found there.
You look more like an elf to me.
Eric yelped in surprise, but instead of words falling out of his mouth, the tiny woman shoved a flat piece of wood into his mouth. He was ready to reach for her hand, trying to pull it away from him, when the bell above the door jingled once more, and no less than 9 bodies fell into the already cramped room. Judging by the familiar traits of white hair, pale, dappled skin, and red eyes, Eric could only assume that these people were Indiga's family. His mother crawled out from beneath the pile, her head encircled by an aura of curly white hair, and she spun around.
Oh, there you are, dear.
She flew to her son's side and embraced him.
Oh, you had us so worried. We didn't expect you back for another month.
The father was attempting to restore order to the room, scolding the children as he plucked each one up off the floor to set them on their feet. Eric watched them carefully, but instead his head was pulled to one side when Grammy grabbed him by the ear to look into it. She then ruffled his hair and turned to the others.
Good news, no sign of mange.
He shook off the weird comment and fixed his hair before his attention returned to the gaggle of people swarming around Indiga. His father clapped him on the shoulder, and then each sibling hugged him in turn. Well, what they could reach. His mother hadn't let go of him yet. Eric found the scene almost unbearable to watch. When was the last time his mother had embraced him like that? And he couldn't remember if Vel had ever offered him a jovial smile and a brotherly hug. And his father... Eric was saved from the edge of that dangerous mental rabbit hole when the old woman pulled out a thermometer with a flourish.
Roll over!
His mind still elsewhere, Eric was numbly complying when he felt tiny fingers wrap around the waistband of his pants, and his attention shot back to the moment.
Whoa! Oh, no! No, no, no!
He jumped out of the cot, stumbling until his back hit a wall. Up close, he could now see, even with his poor eyesight, that it had been plastered with anatomy posters and diagrams of animals. This was not a human hospital like he had assumed. He whipped his head back around to his new friend, a vein bulging in his neck.
Is this a veterinary office?
Indiga, who was busy zooming his youngest brother Isaac over his head like he was an airplane, halted and returned a confused look to the elf.
Of course it is.
My grandmother here, he paused, motioning to the old woman with a nod of his head, is the best healer we have in Oakary. She fixed my legs. He set down his little brother. Besides, the nearest hospital is a 2-day drive from here. So, take what you get and be happy with it, I always say.
Dogs, cats, people, not much difference when you get down to it.
Grammy let out a cackle of laughter.
Now, trousers off. I need to grab your tail to take your temperature.
Eric's eyes shot from the sulky's mangled legs back down to the ancient woman approaching him with the thermometer. She offered him a gummy smile as she only had 3 teeth left in her mouth. He shot a panicked look down at his blackened fingers, then back over to those mangled legs, then back down at his fingers.
Nope.
Eric shuffled around the woman, heading for the door.
You know what? Thanks for getting me here.
He gave a curt nod of his head towards Indiga, forcing a fake smile on his face as he did.
But, I don't have time for this.
He reached for the knob when the old woman tugged on his pants once more.
You need to calm down.
No!
Eric spun, trying to back away.
You need to calm down. I have places to be, people and worlds to save.
He struggled against the surprisingly strong woman.
Not until you've been treated. Frostbite is serious.
His mind racing, Eric reached for any idea that could get him out of this. It landed on his tried-and-true bluff that got him through the last 18 months on this foreign world.
Unhand me! I am the King of Ebra, and I will not be butchered by some quack vet.
He used his strength, what little he had, to lurch towards the door, but something sharp bit into his thigh right above his knee.
Ow!
He spun, looking down to see the doctor pulling a giant needle out of his leg while wearing a pleased grin. He leveled a wobbly finger at her.
You dare assault the king?
The world spun, and Eric quickly found the floor with his face. Grammy laughed that cackling laugh once more.
Oh, relax, Your Majesty.
A loud snore cut through the tense silence that hung heavy in the room, and Sagani turned to her son.
Dear, why are you traveling with such a clearly deranged man? Why would he say something like that?
Indiga laughed at the slumbering elf. He's harmless, Mum. Don't worry. Something in my gut tells me he's worth the trouble. Grammy laid the emptied needle of cow tranquilizer on the table and looked around, that wide smile never fading from her face.
There. Now, who wants some fish and cabbage soup?
Oh, we need to get off this thing. I think... Lucas paused, shoving his fingers against his mouth and nose, holding back the gurgle that bubbled up from his stomach. He remained that way until he could trust his open mouth. I think I'm gonna be sick. Apparently, riding around, clutched to the side of a beast that consumed garbage for a living, did not guarantee them fresh air. The creature itself was not immune to the spoils of the job, literally and figuratively, and the scent that roiled off the Agdillo was such a combination of smells, like rotten onions boiled in molten sewage, that Lucas wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his brain functioning. Atlas, more than ready to agree, didn't dare trust his own mouth at the moment. In his haste to flee from the jewel, he had grabbed hold of a particularly rancid portion of the Agdillo's fur, and was now fighting to keep the bile in his stomach. He gave the dryad a thumbs up and let go of the galloping beast, landing carefully on his good leg. Lucas followed suit, releasing his hold on the matted fur, and he stumbled onto the sidewalk beside the Arcanist. The two of them stood in silence, watching the creature bowl over a half-dozen pedestrians before it turned and disappeared out of sight. He turned to his new friend.
Now that we aren't in danger of being drowned or choked to death, can you explain to me what happened? This doesn't look like the city we left.
He looked up at a sky so black it swallowed the light from the stars. But flashes of blue broke across the darkness, like phantom wisps wading through the void. Atlas was attempting to stave off a panic attack brought on by olfactory overload, and he almost missed everything that was said. He let out a groan as he massaged the spot between his eyebrows. That's because this isn't that glowing city. He looked up at last, lowering his hands. This is the space between worlds, the infernal realm. A cold wave of dread washed over Lucas, and he felt the color fade from his cheeks.
So we're in hell. We died.
Atlas shook his head, rubbing a finger beneath his nose with a sniff. No, we're not dead, but this might as well be hell. He sighed. Right, the quick version. If all the worlds in the multiverse were rocks along a riverbed, the infernal realm would be the river. He jabbed a thumb upwards. See all those blue ghosties up there? They're actually people traveling through gateways, jumping from pebble to pebble, or just moving across their own stone like we were trying to do.
They're inside portals, pressing up against the edge of their realities. Something happened to our portal and we got pulled out halfway there. See, the way it works is..."
As he listened to the Arcanist drone on and on about magical theory of worlds and rotations, Lucas's eyelids grew heavy, his senses dulling, until a flickering light caught his attention instead. He looked up to see the lamppost they had been stopped beneath was not electric, but rather the glass cage of an absolutely grotesque giant lightning bug. Its head reminded him of a cantankerous old man shoved onto the mutated body of a cockroach. It turned its scowling face away and flashed its glowing orange rear end at him. He chuckled a little to himself, fishing out the camera from his bag. He wound the fob at the top and snuck a picture of the thing when it turned back around.
Which, of course, would only apply in a linear transition. Does that clear things up?
Lucas blinked in surprise, focusing back on the Arcanist as he shoved the camera back into his bag. "Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, mate. I stopped listening sometime after Wet Rocks." His one eye twitching, Atlas forced a painful smile on his face.
"Shorter version, then. City bad. Us screwed."
He lifted his brows.
"Is that clear enough for you?"
But the Dryad made no impression of understanding. Throwing up his hands, he turned and started walking down the street. Lucas merely followed the Arcanist, listening to him mumble to himself. As they walked under a luminous billboard depicting a bright yellow square with purple letters that read Guillermo's Agdillo Sanitation Station and a phone number, it didn't look remotely like numbers, a delicious smell filled the street. They turned onto a larger, busier thoroughfare full of minuscule vendors behind minuscule carts, crafting minuscule street food for a variety of tiny people. In fact, almost everything here was in miniature, save for the trash beasts. Even the soot-covered buildings, which reminded him of a seedy, hellish version of the big cities back home, were imp-sized. But there were more than just the furry little creatures. There were small humanoid-looking folks with giant noses and clumsy-looking extremities. There were squat toad-like people with long ears, and even a pair that walked by that reminded him of dwarves straight out of a fantasy novel. Lucas followed them with his eyes for a breath before he was returned to the moment by the tantalizing aroma that filled his nose and caused his stomach to rumble painfully. Now away from the Agdillo and its stench, he was reminded that it had been nearly a full day since his last meal. He reached out and tugged on the Arcanist's arm. "Can't we stop for something to eat?" Before Atlas could respond, there was a loud crack, and a tiny, violent pink imp fell out of a puff of smoke and glitter.
"You want food? I can help."
A long, wicked smile unfurled on its face, in time with the scroll it held in its hands.
"Bah, get out of here, you little filth rag. No one needs any of your hogwash spells."
Atlas swung out a poorly aimed kick towards the imp, clipping it on its knuckles instead of its head. The creature jumped back, yelping angrily, and sauntered off, scowling at them with narrowed eyes. Atlas turned back to the Dryad, leveling a finger on him.
"Don't go asking for things round here. This place runs off the magic of contracts, and there's no breaking them. Sure, they can get you anything you wish for, but you'll be paying them back tenfold for anything you get."
He paused, an afterthought occurring to him.
"If you're lucky."
"Anything?" Lucas's hand cinched tighter around the strap of his bag, his mind drifting towards the small, ornate wooden box within. Atlas twisted his face into a "What did I just say?" scowl, and turned around when the Dryad wilted in defeat. He lowered his hand to push them against his hips.
Now we need to focus on a way to get out of here.
What about our robot friend?
Groaning, Atlas's head lolled back as he shook his fist towards the heavens.
It's always something.
Distracted by a commotion, Lucas turned his gaze on a busy intersection to see a tiny imp with bright yellow fur was directing traffic after a minor collision of several taxi-like cars. At least, he thought they were cars. They were honking like cars, but they had no wheels. Instead, they moved on long and scaly limbs that ended in flat, six-fingered hands, the most likely cause of the pileup, as the limbs were all tangled up with each other. Lucas shuddered, his mouth turning into an upside-down U before he forced his eyes to return to the cop. He had an idea, and tugged on the Arcanist's arm once more with a half-smile. Atlas glanced down at the hand on his medical gown sleeve, then over in the direction the Dryad was facing. He saw the impish cop, and in an instant knew exactly what the man was thinking.
Let me guess. You want to get arrested, find our robot, and then break out?
Exactly.
Atlas shook his head in disbelief.
Are you out of your mind? It's not going to happen. Nobody can break out of an impish prison.
What about all that fancy magic back there? Just summon another swarm of flamingos, distract the guards, and bang bang boom, Bob's your uncle.
I do have an uncle named Bob, but listen, that was an accident. Magic from outside the infernal realm goes, let's just say it goes wild. That fireball could have just as easily have transformed us into gophers.
Atlas shook his head.
Let's just forget about the robot. He's just a machine.
That robot might be our only guide back in that golden city. Knowing where to look in a giant haystack full of armed soldiers might be worth a lot. Our cash cow?
Lucas stopped, a wide smile cutting across his face.
Or maybe, after that landing, a trash cow?
Stop. That was... No.
Lucas barked a laugh, then his smile dimmed a little.
You'd do it if it was Barry.
Atlas rolled his eye, but his shoulders sank in defeat. He turned to see that the two of them, stopped in the middle of a busy food highway, had grabbed the attention of the traffic cop. He glanced back to the Dryad.
Getting in is the easy part. Are you sure you want to do this?
When the other man nodded, Atlas let out a long sigh. He knew what this was about to put in motion, and he had been hoping to avoid it. He turned to face the impish cop and waved at her, forcing a toothy grin on his own face. And when she rounded on him completely, he reached behind him and pulled the string that secured the gown to his body with a yank. The entire thing crumpled to the ground, and he stood as triumphantly as he could, his one busted leg making that difficult, while he shoved his fists against his hips. Unprepared for the Arcanist to whip out his tackle box again, Lucas shied away with a grimace. But before he could even voice his own disgust, a flurry of things all happened at once, as if another flock of flamingos had been magically summoned into existence. The line of food vendors and customers behind them screamed in horror, scrambling over and around each other to flee the sight of that bare rump. Hot dogs spilled out onto the street. Tortillas were flapping in the wind, and condiment bottles were exploding in the wake of the chaos.
Public nudity!
The tinny shriek of a whistle sounded as the imp shouted at them,
Public nudity!
Atlas just shook his head. Imps were notoriously prudish. By the time calm had descended once more, the area all but cleared out of people, 4 walls sprang up around them and a concrete slab slammed in above their heads, pushing their cage down into the earth. Through the single cramped window, Lucas watched in awe as first dirt and then the world flashed by them. The city, streetlights, houses, cars, and citizens were all whizzing by them at frightening speeds. Although, the moment the cage came to a stop and the pair of them were slammed into the far wall, Lucas felt the magic of the moment leave him as quickly as the air left his lungs. He slumped to the ground, shaking his head a little to clear his haze. They were in a slightly larger concrete room now, with iron bars along one wall. It wasn't until two coiled metal arms plucked him off the ground that he realized their plan had worked. He smiled up at that metal man, giving him a proud tap on the center panel of his chest. "Ah, it's good to see you, buddy." He turned back to the Arcanist, the robot having plucked him up off the ground as well, and grinned at him. A grin that quickly turned into an upside-down U once more when he saw that the medical gown had not made the journey with them.
So, you said getting out's the difficult part. Do you have any ideas?
Just one. And, for the record, I don't like it.
Atlas moved slowly to the wall of iron bars, reluctant. His hands gripping the metal to give him strength, he pressed his face against them, ensuring his voice would travel.
"I'd like to speak to my lawyer."
Lucas watched as, for the third time that day, a body appeared in a puff of glittering smoke. This one was short, round, and could probably hear conversations in the next county over with how long his ears were. The figure rounded on their cell, setting down his briefcase.
"All right, who called for—"
His automatic speech fell away as it was replaced with a devilish grin.
Well. If it isn't my favorite client."
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
Welcome, Grisbane Club Hub. How can we...
Run! Bad things! Save Chet!
Hey, Chet, break over a long time ago. Where you?
His attack! World end!
Uh-huh. You said that last week.
He's real!
Get back work.
But...
Is no excuse. You on crusty plate duty now.
Fine! Stinky boss man hope the Agdillo mistake you for garbage.
What that?
Nothing! Should have gone with Cousin Akaz when had chance.